pause. Before you decide what to eat tonight, consider this question carefully. How many of your food choices are actually yours? Not what brand you prefer, not what ad you remember, but who decided what options appeared in front of you in the first place? Because the uncomfortable reality is this: most people don't choose their food. They choose from a list that was chosen for them, and that list is far smaller and far more controlled than it looks. In the next few minutes, we're going to peel back a system most people never question. Not through outrage, not through speculation, but through patterns, incentives, and history. And once you see the structure underneath your grocery store, it becomes very difficult to unsee. Stay with me. Walk into almost any supermarket in America. Whether you're in California, Texas, Ohio, or New York, the shelves look different, but the ownership behind them doesn't. Hundreds of brands, thousands of products, an overwhelming sense of choice. Yet behind this appearance of abundance is something far more concentrated. A small number of corporate groups dominate global food production, processing, distribution, and pricing. And behind those corporations is an even smaller circle of controlling shareholders, family offices, and long-term capital holders. Not celebrities, not household names, not people who appear on magazine covers. Quiet capital. This documentary is not about secret meetings or shadowy villains. It's about incentives, scale, and what happens when food, the most basic human necessity, becomes an industrial system optimized for profit efficiency rather than resilience or choice. And this pattern is not new. Throughout history, control over food has always meant control over people. In ancient civilizations, grain storage determined political power. In medieval Europe, land ownership determined survival. During wars, blockades targeted food supply first, not armies. The Roman Empire understood this well. Bread shortages caused riots faster than tax increases. The phrase bread in circuses wasn't poetic, it was operational policy. When food flows freely, societies feel stable. When it doesn't, everything else becomes negotiable. What's changed today is not that food equals power. What's changed is how quietly that power operates. Modern food control does not look like domination. It looks like efficiency. It looks like logistics, supply chains, risk management, cost optimization, language that sounds neutral, even responsible. But systems don't need malicious intent to produce harmful outcomes. They only need aligned incentives. And the incentives shaping your food system today are clear. Let's start with something simple. Most Americans believe food competition works like this. Many companies compete, prices stay fair, innovation thrives. That assumption made sense decades ago. But over time, mergers, acquisitions, and vertical integration changed the structure. What used to be hundreds of independent producers became layers of ownership stacked on top of one another. Seed companies merged with chemical companies. Processing firms bought distribution networks. Retailers developed private labels tied to the same suppliers. Competition didn't disappear, it concentrated. And concentration doesn't eliminate choice, it controls it. Here's where the illusion begins. You see 10 different brands of cereal, but the grain comes from the same suppliers. The processing comes from the same facilities. The shelf placement is negotiated by the same corporate contracts. The branding feels diverse. The economics are not. And above these corporations sit long-term capital holders whose timelines stretch decades, not quarters. They don't manage products. They manage exposure. Food is not emotional to them. It's defensive, inelastic, predictable. People must eat, regardless of economic conditions, which makes food systems uniquely attractive to patient capital. This brings us to the first uncomfortable pattern. When an industry becomes essential, complex, and capital intensive, ownership consolidates naturally, not through conspiracy, through math. Large players can absorb volatility, small players cannot. Large players can negotiate supply contracts, small players cannot. Large players survive price shocks, small players disappear. Over time, survival becomes scale dependent, and scale attracts capital. At this point, you might be thinking, so what? Corporations own everything. That's true, but food is different. You can delay buying a phone, you can cancel a subscription, you can postpone a vacation, you cannot opt out of eating. Which means control over food doesn't require force, it requires positioning, and that positioning happens upstream, far away from the grocery aisle. Here's the part most people never see. Before food, it becomes inputs, seeds, fertilizers, processing infrastructure, transportation routes, storage facilities, commodity pricing mechanisms. Control those, and the rest follows naturally. You don't need to control the consumer. You control the system the consumer depends on. And this is where ownership becomes invisible. Let's pause here. If this is making sense so far, stay with me, because the next layer explains why this structure keeps reinforcing itself, even when people try to change it. In the past, food production was local by necessity. Distance limited control. Today, technology removed distance, but replaced it with dependency. A modern grocery store depends on global shipping energy markets. financial hedging, data forecasting, regulatory compliance. This complexity doesn't empower independence, it eliminates it. Only actors with deep capital and long planning horizons can operate reliably within this system, which means that over time, ownership drifts upward, away from visibility, away from accountability, away from local control. Not because anyone planned it that way, because the system rewards it. Now let's talk about pricing. Food prices feel volatile to consumers. But at the institutional level, volatility is opportunity. Large food conglomerates hedge risk. They lock in futures. They arbitrage logistics inefficiencies. Smaller producers sell at prices they don't control. Larger holders profit from fluctuations themselves. This creates a quiet asymmetry. One side reacts, the other anticipates. And anticipation is power. Historically, whenever a society allowed food systems to become too centralized, fragility followed. Ancient Egypt survived famine because it decentralized grain storage. Rome struggled when supply lines stretched too far. Colonial systems collapsed when monocrop dependencies failed. Complex systems optimize for efficiency, not resilience, and efficiency works beautifully until it doesn't. The difference today is that fragility is masked by financial smoothing. Shortages are delayed, price spikes are softened, signals are absorbed, which means when stress finally appears, it arrives suddenly. This always happens next. But here's the critical distinction. This documentary is not arguing that hidden billionaires are maliciously planning outcomes. That narrative is too simple, and usually wrong. What we're examining is something more unsettling. A system where outcomes emerge even when no one is explicitly trying to cause them, where decision makers are insulated from consequences, where responsibility diffuses upward into structures rather than individuals, and where control exists without visibility. Ask yourself this. If a small group owns stakes across seeds, processing, logistics, and retail, directly or indirectly, how much influence do they have without ever issuing an order? They don't need to dictate behavior. They shape the environment in which decisions become obvious. And once incentives are aligned, behavior follows naturally. This is why food control today doesn't feel like control. There are no soldiers, no ration cards, no visible restrictions, just price signals, availability, product reformulations, quiet substitutions. Choice still exists, within boundaries. And boundaries are where power lives. Let's introduce a historical parallel. In the late 19th century, railroads controlled American commerce. They didn't own goods, they owned access. Farmers could grow anything they wanted, but without rail access, it didn't matter. Rail barons didn't dictate what farmers planted. They dictated what could reach markets profitably. Food systems today operate the same way, but with more layers. Control isn't visible at the shelf, it's embedded in infrastructure. And this is where things become psychologically difficult to accept. Because the system doesn't feel oppressive, it feels convenient. Abundance everywhere, food anytime, global variety, which makes the trade-off invisible. Centralization increases efficiency until it increases dependency, and dependency shifts power, quietly. At this point, many viewers experience resistance. This sounds exaggerated. Markets correct themselves. There are regulations. Those responses are rational. But history suggests something else. Markets correct, but only after stress. Regulation follows, not leads. And systems drift toward concentration unless deliberately interrupted. That's not ideology, that's pattern. Here's a question worth sitting with. If control over food gradually moved away from farmers, communities, and consumers, who gained it? Not individuals in capes, not villains, but institutions with long memory, deep pockets, and limited visibility. Family offices, asset managers, strategic capital pools, entities that don't need publicity and often avoid it. This is where the term hidden billionaires becomes accurate. Not because they're secret, because their influence doesn't require recognition. Food control today does not look like domination. It looks like optimization. Ownership concentrates not through commands, but through incentives. Power accumulates not through visibility, but through structure. Now we need to ask the harder question. What happens to a system like this when it is stressed? Because history shows us something uncomfortable. Food systems don't fail gradually, they fail suddenly. And the conditions that precede those moments are almost always misunderstood while they're happening. Let's step back. For most of modern history, food prices moved slowly. They were boring, predictable. That stability shaped behavior. Governments assumed food would remain affordable. Consumers assumed shelves would remain full. Markets assumed logistics would function normally. But stability creates blind spots. When systems work too well for too long, they encourage over-optimization. And over-optimization always reduces resilience. This is not theory, this is pattern. Every major historical food disruption followed the same arc. First, efficiency increases, then margins tighten, then buffers disappear, then a shock arrives. The shock itself is rarely the cause, it's the trigger. The cause is always structural. Look at the 1970s. Energy shocks didn't just raise fuel prices. They reshaped food costs globally. Transportation became expensive. Fertilizers followed energy markets. Food inflation spiked faster than wages. Governments reacted late. Consumers reacted emotionally. But the deeper shift happened quietly. Large agribusiness firms survived, small producers disappeared, consolidation accelerated, and ownership moved further away from visibility. Now fast forward. The early 2000s introduced financialization into commodities at scale. Food was no longer just food, it became an asset class. Hedging increased stability on paper, but it also tied food prices more tightly to global financial conditions. Interest rates, liquidity cycles, capital flows. Suddenly, what happened in bond markets mattered to grocery prices. This connection was not obvious to consumers, but it mattered enormously to capital holders. Then came the global financial crisis. Banks collapsed, housing collapsed, trust collapsed. But food systems did something interesting. They didn't collapse, they consolidated. Cheap capital flowed to entities considered essential. Food production, processing, and distribution became defensive investments. Long-term capital entered aggressively, not because people were hungry, because food was stable. This always happens next. Here's the part most people don't talk about. Crises don't weaken concentrated systems, they strengthen them. Because when volatility rises, scale becomes survival. Smaller players need flexibility, larger players already have it. And after each shock, the system emerges more centralized than before. That pattern repeats across industries. But again, food is different, because demand never disappears. Now consider inflation. Most people experience inflation as price increases. But inflation is more than that. It's a redistribution mechanism. It shifts power from wage earners to asset holders. Food inflation is especially revealing, because when food prices rise faster than incomes, people adjust behavior immediately. They don't protest first, they substitute. Cheaper options, processed foods, lower quality inputs. And who benefits from substitution? The firms that control scale, processing, and distribution, not local producers, not consumers. At this point, something subtle happens psychologically. People feel squeezed, but they don't feel targeted. There's no obvious enemy, just a sense that choices are narrowing, the quality is declining, the prices feel unfair, but without a clear cause, which diffuses accountability. And diffused accountability protects systems. Let's talk about ownership again, carefully. Most controlling interests in global food systems are not direct operators. They don't run factories, they don't manage farms, they hold stakes across multiple layers, seeds, chemicals, processing, logistics, retail. This diversification reduces risk, but it also creates influence without fingerprints. When incentives align across layers, outcomes coordinate naturally, no meeting required. This is why food systems feel apolitical. They operate above ideology. They respond to capital conditions, not public opinion, which creates a disconnect. Governments talk about affordability, corporations talk about margins, capital talks about exposure. All three use different language, but only one controls time horizons. Now we need to address something carefully. This documentary is not saying people are starving. In the United States, shelves are full. That's precisely why this topic is difficult. Control does not require scarcity, it requires dependency. And dependency is strongest when alternatives disappear quietly. Think about diversity. Food diversity appears to be increasing. Global flavors, new brands, endless variation. But diversity of products is not the same as diversity of ownership. You can have thousands of SKUs controlled by the same upstream actors, which means risk is not distributed. It's hidden. This is a critical distinction. Here's a historical analogy that matters. In the early 20th century, banking appeared diverse. Thousands of banks, different names, different locations. But interbank exposure connected them invisibly. When stress hit, collapse spread instantly. Food systems today share similar characteristics. Interconnected, leveraged, optimized, stable until they aren't. This brings us to the uncomfortable question: what happens when multiple stresses overlap? Energy volatility, climate disruptions, geopolitical fragmentation, financial tightening, not catastrophically, incrementally. Small disruptions become normal. Margins shrink, buffers thin, then something that would have been absorbed before isn't. This is how systems tip, not loudly, quietly. This next part explains why this time feels different, without claiming certainty. In the past, food shocks were often regional. Today, systems are global. A disruption in one area propagates everywhere. Supply chains are synchronized, efficiency removed slack, which means shocks transmit faster than responses. This increases sensitivity, and sensitivity increases volatility. But again, volatility does not hurt everyone equally. Large, diversified holders can absorb it. They hedge, they adjust portfolios, they pass costs downstream. Consumers cannot hedge groceries, they adjust consumption. which reinforces consolidation, the system tightens. Pause here. If this pattern feels familiar, it should. We've seen it in housing, we've seen it in healthcare, we've seen it in education. Essential systems drift upward in ownership over time. Food is simply catching up. Now let's address regulation. Regulation exists, oversight exists, but regulation reacts to outcomes, not structures. And by the time outcomes appear, ownership has already shifted. Regulators regulate operators. Capital structures remain untouched. This creates an asymmetry. Responsibility is visible. Control is not. At this stage, some viewers feel resignation. This is inevitable. That reaction is understandable, but incomplete. Understanding systems is not about panic, it's about clarity. And clarity creates optionality, but only if it comes early enough. Here's the most important idea in this entire documentary. Control over food does not mean control over individuals. It means influence over constraints. You still choose what you eat, but you choose within boundaries shaped by forces far upstream. Recognizing that doesn't remove choice, it contextualizes it. So where does this leave us? Not with predictions, not with dates, not with collapsed narratives, but with an unresolved tension. History shows that highly optimized, centralized food systems are stable until they face overlapping stress. History also shows that stress always returns. The only unknown is timing and magnitude. What makes the present moment unusual is not crisis. It's alignment, economic pressure, geopolitical uncertainty, environmental variability, financial tightening. None of these guarantee disruption. But together, they reduce margin for error. And margin is what prevents tipping points. So ask yourself this, not emotionally, but analytically. If food systems are more centralized than ever, if buffers are thinner than before, if ownership is more distant from consequences, then when stress arrives, who absorbs it? Who adapts? And who has no choice but to react? This documentary does not end with answers. It ends with awareness. Because systems don't change because people are scared. They change when people understand patterns early enough to respond rationally. You don't need to reject modern food systems. You don't need to romanticize the past. But you do need to see the structure clearly. Because clarity is the difference between surprise and preparation. And this is where the discussion should begin. Not with blame, but with understanding. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If control over food has quietly shifted upward over decades, what other systems might be following the same path? Right now, without attracting attention? That question matters. Because history suggests food is never the last system to centralize, it's usually the first. If you want deeper explanations of economic systems, not headlines or opinions, subscribe, because the forces shaping your future don't announce themselves. They repeat, quietly.